Hi, everybody. You guys can hear us. We're just going to wait for a few more people to join, and then we'll kick it off in a little bit. Okay, great. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar on standing up your first compliance framework, common misconceptions and best practices. My name is Tara Marcus from Hyperproof, and I will be the host for today's webinar. We will be getting started in just a moment, but before we do, I wanted to remind you of a few housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded, and you will be able to access it on demand using the same link that you used to register for the webinar. Second, we will have about 10 minutes at the end of the webinar for Q&A. We highly encourage questions, so if you have any, please submit them to the question box to your right, and I will read them to the speakers once we get to that portion of the presentation. With that said, I would like to briefly introduce our speakers. They're going to get into a bit more detailed when they get to kind of their chance, but today we have speakers Charlie Wood, Executive Vice President from Bonadio, and Aaron Poulsen, Senior Director of Security, Risk, and Compliance at Hyperproof. With that said, I would now like to hand it off to Aaron to kick things off.
Thanks, Taryn, and thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. As Taryn mentioned, my name is Aaron Poulsen. I'm the Senior Director of InfoSec, Risk, and Compliance at Hyperproof. I've been doing information security and compliance, as my primary job for the last 5 years. I've been in some version of security and IT and tech for the last 20 plus years, and work for Hyperproof, which is just a brief introduction to Hyperproof. We're a compliance operations platform intended to streamline and gain visibility into your compliance, risk, audit, vendor, and security assurance operations. We support about 50 security, regulatory, privacy, and risk programs. I'm going to hand it off to Charlie for his introduction, and we'll move on to the agenda.
Thanks, Aaron, and thanks everybody for joining today. I'm Charlie Wood. I'm an Executive Vice President and partner of the Bonadio Group. I've been with the firm for 12 years. I've been in industry for 24. I've been on both sides of the table when it comes to the audits. I was a system administrator and a programmer for 9 years. So I've been audited, and now I'm the auditor. So I think I have a bit of a unique background when it comes to what it takes to become compliant and maintain compliance when it comes to any sort of regulatory framework that you may need to be compliant with. So appreciate everybody's time, and looking forward to talking to you about what it takes to become compliant.
Thanks, Charlie. Yeah, one day I may flip on to the other side and audit people, but has not happened yet. So, so running through the agenda, this is I think this is a great pairing for this particular webinar, because from the auditee side and the auditor side, there are a number of points that we see some confusion around compliance, and a lot of it's just where to get started. And so for most of the presentation, actually, we'll go through the agenda here. This is what we'll be doing today, is just going over some of these common questions around compliance. Where is the confusion? And introducing, we've narrowed it down to 5 best practices: conducting risk assessments. If you hear risk assessment and you bristle, I understand. Do you really need to do it? Spoiler, you really need to do it. But we'll talk about that in a few slides. What's required by virtually all compliance frameworks? If you spend any time looking through these different frameworks, and by the way, I'll use frameworks and programs interchangeably during this webinar. So think of it as just a set of requirements, set of discrete requirements. But if you do any time reading through these, 3 or 4 of them, you'll see there's a lot of overlap, and a lot of commonalities. So we'll kind of touch on, what do most of these require? Types of policies needed for compliance programs. There's some that are very specific to the program that applies to you, but there's some very generic kind of foundational policies. We'll discuss those. Kind of a big one, selecting and implementing controls. What is a control? First of all, we'll cover that. We hear about controls all the time, and there is a lot of confusion around what are they, what applies to me, how do I get them, where do they come from, et cetera. And then what do I do once I have a control? And to wrap up the best practices, preparing for an external audit. We do a lot of work to run our internal compliance programs, but ultimately, there is a final exam, which is an external audit, where we bring someone in like Charlie's team. They come in and they audit us to see how well we comply with these programs. Lastly, we'll go over maintaining a compliance program after the audit is over, and the audit's never really over. We'll cover that a little bit, but once the audit ends, the new one begins. And then finally, we'll do a Q&A session at the end. Great, so let me kick this off. I'm going to hand this over to Charlie, actually, some of the questions that we've seen. But Charlie, why don't you take this first question? And
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So, we're out in industry quite a bit, and we're, talking to customers across multiple verticals, and they all seem to have the same questions when it comes to compliance. And one of the big things that they've been hearing over the past 9 to 12 months is how long does it take to become compliant, and how long does it take to have an audit? There's, some literature out there that says it can be done in 2 weeks. And, what I often tell people is if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. That would be an extremely heavy lift for any organization to put the controls in place that are required to be compliant with any law, regulation, and standard in a short 2-week window. The foundation of building the control framework and becoming compliant is first having a risk assessment done. So Aaron, can you talk about, your experience in the risk assessment space?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of a loaded question, isn't it? What does it take to be compliant? There really is no quick and easy answer to that. There's a lot that goes into it. And as Charlie pointed out, a risk assessment is crucial to ensuring compliance. There's a lot of things that spin out of a risk assessment. Good data that goes into it, and then the output of a risk assessment touches on many different things within your organization, including the kind of rounding out your control set. We'll talk about controls in a little bit here, but there's like an initial selection of controls based on programs that you could write. But what we're really doing here in our security and compliance functions is we're trying to manage risk. And I don't want to say it's impossible because I've seen it done, but it's really difficult to manage risk if you haven't first performed a risk assessment. And we'll get to that in a couple of slides. Kind of moving away from risk assessment, automation is the big thing. We hear exactly, what can we automate? Can I automate everything? Can I just automate my compliance program? The brutal truth is no, you can't automate your compliance program. However, you can automate certain aspects of your compliance program, things like evidence collection, tasks, recurring tasks. But compliance has never been something that you just push a button and it goes and you pass audits. Charlie, any additional color you can add around that one?
Yeah, you hit it right on the head. You can extract the data using automated tools. However, there's a human element associated with almost every control. Right? If you think about just something as simple as capturing log activity, well, you can capture that via, a software solution, and it may have some artificial intelligence in it. But at the end of the day, there's a human element that needs to be put into play to look at it from a reasonableness perspective. So again, you can collect a lot of it automatically, but you got to have that human review.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Charlie. And then actually this last bullet, Charlie, can you take that one?
Yeah.
To you.
Do I need to hire a security compliance expert, or can I use or get the guidance I need with software that has pre-built policies? Software that has pre-built policies will probably get you, 50% of the way there, because there are foundational controls that are associated with every control framework, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes, but each of the policies and procedures need to be customized based on your organization. And as Aaron said before, based on your organizational risk. So you can get a portion of the way there, but completely there, I have not seen. And Aaron, since you're writing these policies traditionally, have you seen anything on that side?
No, not at all. There are good resources out there to start the policy creation, the policy development for sure. And we'll be going over, as we go through this webinar, we'll talk about, there are absolutely some things to kind of jumpstart your compliance program. But it's important to remember that when you get audited, the auditor is auditing you and your organization, how well you meet the requirements that apply to you, not how well you've applied a template or borrowed someone's controls and stood those up. They have to reflect your organization. So pre-built policies, yeah, absolutely, Charlie. Maybe 50%, depending on the program that those policies apply to. But I don't think I've ever seen it go end to end where it applies to your company. It doesn't make sense that would work that way. It defies the definition of a template because it has to be specific to your organization.
And this slide touches on the things that we started on the last, and it's claims that we see on compliance software websites. So, you can prepare for a security audit in weeks and not months. That's a bit misleading. It depends on where you are in the compliance, process. Have you done your risk assessment? Do you know where your critical risks are? Do you know your people, processes, and technology, where the holes are? So you need to know a lot of other things in order to really be able to gauge whether or not you can do this in weeks and not months. And one of the things that always bothers me when I hear that is I feel a lot of times when that's advertised that people are trying to circumvent the true spirit of what the controls are there for and what those control frameworks have been built for. And that is to ensure security of your data, your customer information, so that you can reasonably avoid a breach. And so when I hear that it can just be done using automated tools and done quickly, I get concerned. And as I said at the onset of this presentation, I've been on both sides of the table. And I can confidently tell you that it's very difficult to do something in a short period of time, even with a high amount of funds to purchase and implement the controls. Use our software to automate SOC 2 and ISO 27001 compliance. We touched on this. There's a human element to everything. You can use those tools to extract data, but somebody's got to look at them from a reasonableness perspective and provide the auditor or whoever's looking at that information with reasonable comfort that the information that has been extracted is appropriate. Use our policy templates and continuous monitoring tools to get audit ready in half the time. Again, the policies, if you use policy templates, they're going to get you about half of the way there. And the continuous monitoring tools, again, they require that human element. So it's a bit misleading. It'll save you time, but it may not, cut it in half. Our security assurance platform gives you pre-built policies, mapped to SOC, ISO, and guides you to collect what you need to pass an audit and get certified. Again, a little bit misleading. The template policies have the foundation for what should be put in place, but because of the unique nature of every environment, service offering, the people, the processes, and technology, those policies and that platform need to be heavily customized in order to truly meet the spirit of the control objective and ensure the security of your customer information. What these imply, compliance technology can solve all of your compliance problems. They can't. That human element, as I keep saying, is a critical piece. Aaron, on your side of the table, is there anything that you can think of that could add some additional clarity or color to this?
I agree with everything you've said, Charlie. Absolutely. And the message is not, there aren't efficient ways to stand up and maintain your compliance program. There absolutely are. And there are a lot of good tools out there that will help you. But it's more of a warning that there's a lot of work that goes into maintaining a compliance program and your security programs. And it's not just the initial stand-up that you can do in 2 weeks. I saw actually a vendor say that they could get you FedRAMPed in, I think it was 60 days. If anyone is aware of FedRAMP and what it is, FedRAMP preparation can realistically take upwards of a year. And so there's a lot of work that I think gets passed over and not mentioned with these claims. But there are absolutely some tools, some methods, and some best practices that will help you on your way. And software is part of that. It absolutely is. It can help you do your compliance work more efficiently, and this is through mapping of controls, mapping of requirements. We'll talk about that in a little bit, and that automation piece that would allow you to collect evidence faster, set up recurring tasks so you're doing things on the cadence that you need to comply with, depending on the various programs. They do need to be tailored to your organization. This is crucial. There are a lot of tools out there to help identify which controls that you would want to implement for a particular framework or program. However, each of those controls, even though it may look like you're doing them, you have to look at the little nuances within the control language. You really should be going through all of the controls that you adopt in your organization and make sure they reflect your operations. They do need to be tailored to you. And while it's a great help to have, some illustrative controls, it still requires you. It's that human element that Charlie mentioned. It still requires you to go in and make sure they reflect your organization, because that's what the auditor is going to test you against, is how well that control that you've tailored to you meets the requirement. I'm actually not sure about this third bullet point. They're meant to make your organization more secure. I believe this is pertaining also to controls, which is true. They are there to help make you more secure, resilient, and operationally effective. And they're really a big one here is the controls are really intended to help you manage risk to a level that's acceptable to you and your management. This is a good one here. And I'm going to say compliance involves everyone, and not just the compliance and IT teams. It's very common. Probably not as you start out as a smaller organization, but as you get into larger organizations, security is handled by security, compliance is handled by compliance. But those two functions are enterprise-wide. Every employee has ownership to some degree in your company staying compliant and your company staying secure.
And if I can interrupt there.
Yep.
One of the things that we always see our first year doing these audits is that people think that this is an IT issue. And it's not. It spans outside of IT. You think about something as simple as hiring or firing someone, right? You've got to have, background check done by HR. You've got to have HR notify you when someone's being let go, because you can't remove somebody from the system if you don't know that they're being terminated or either voluntarily or involuntary. So we often hear that it's just an IT issue, and it's not. It actually spans the entire organization. Another good example is, one of the things that we do when we try to hack an organization, because that's one of our services, is we phish people. And if you don't know what phishing is, we act like we're somebody else, and we try to get information from them, like user ID, password, something that we can leverage to take over the network. So security awareness training for your employees is critical, and that's not an IT issue. That's something that needs to be done for everyone. So those are other things that are portions of a control framework in the SOC 2 space that can't be automated and fall outside of IT. So it's an organization-wide thing, and it sort of underscores what we've been talking about, the inability to automate all the controls.
Yeah, those are really good examples, Charlie. I appreciate that. The HR one in particular, you see more of the HR-related controls getting folded into like the security programs and frameworks, but that's because there are access control issues. But they have their own risks. that are associated with their functions, as do other departments within the company. And then the last bullet point here, it's never done. So once your compliance program is up and running, which is a huge milestone, it needs to be maintained. Your company changes. You're developing products. Your platform will evolve, and all of those changes need to be accommodated within your compliance program, and with your risk management program as well. There you go. So where to start? I have 4 key components here that these aren't strictly necessary to get started on your compliance program, but if you don't do these, you will wish you had at the outset. And they're going to seem pretty obvious, but it's always surprised me how often some of these get overlooked or just taken for granted that they're fully understood. And in fact, as your company grows, it's really easy for the information that we're talking about here to get siloed over time. And we really don't want that to happen at the outset of standing up a compliance program, because the data collected from these 4 components will be used and reused as part of a variety of activities, not just compliance, but around risks and I guess audits. But security team or operations team, they can all benefit from this this collection of data up front. So, excuse me. So know your industry and your customers. Why is this important? It's important because your industry and customers essentially determine the audits and the underlying requirements that you'll need to perform and comply with. If you're working in healthcare, you have to worry about, you'll have to accommodate HIPAA. If you are in the federal space, you have FISMA, you have FedRAMP. If you're just straight up commercial, there's SOC 2 and ISO 27001. They're very popular ones. Everyone deals with privacy. So knowing who really understanding your industry and who your customers are and what their expectations are is the first key component. Next one is to know your tech stack. This one may seem probably the most obvious, but why is this important? You are responsible for the products and services you offer as an organization. And that includes ensuring that your tech stack is implementing adequate security controls. And with increasing importance, everything that can be patched is patched. You hear and read, unfortunately, it's mostly negative news about supply chain or vendor risk management. And there's a lot of attention, or rightfully so, around that supply chain. Sorry, that was the one I was thinking of. And supply chain management. It's very rare that things are developed entirely in-house. Where all our libraries, our tech stack is all something we've developed. We have hardware that runs on. We have networks that runs across. There are libraries that we borrow or we pay for. If anything in your tech stack is compromised, and a security patch had been released, but you weren't keeping up to date on that inventory, so you didn't know about it, that all falls on you. You need to understand what you're running and how you're running it. And so, again, it seems obvious, but it's a good habit to establish early in that maintaining of your assets. 3, the really big one is know your data. Know where it's going, where you're storing it, how you're collecting it. Definitely where it travels. These are all key elements when it comes to privacy and privacy regulation. It's not just GDPR anymore. It's California. They led the way in the States. But there are, I think, 7 states now that have their own privacy regulations. And I expect that would continue until we get to a more, federal level where it applies to everyone. But data privacy is huge. And you have to know where your data is, where you're collecting it, where you're processing it, what you're doing with it. And then finally, and we're going to talk about this next, but know what risks apply to your organization. Excuse me, everyone. You'll likely already have a general idea of the risks that will face your organization. And these are any kind of risks. These are environmental, you're located on a fault line, they're technical, you have old server hardware, administrative, you haven't updated your business continuity plan in years. There's really never a bad time to start thinking about risk, which is why I included it here. But in just a moment, we'll talk about risk assessments and we'll really dig in. And just an intro to our best practices. We've already talked about it. Do you really need a risk assessment? Hopefully by the time we finish talking about a risk assessment on what it gets you, plus it's becoming more and more of a requirement, the answer is a definitive yes. And then what are common requirements across most of the IT frameworks? I think we've covered actually most of this right now. So in the interest of time, I'll get into risk assessments. There we go. So we just talked about these 4 key components. And there's a lot of data that we collect from those 4 key components. Excuse me. Inventory is the big one. And we need to know what exists in our environment before I ever think about a risk assessment. You can't assess something that you don't know about, which is why that inventory is so critical of your assets. Obvious ones like hardware, software, but your data is an asset, which is why it's so important that you know where your data is, how it's being protected. And of course, people. People actually get overlooked a lot when we're talking about risk assessments, but people should be our #1 priority when it comes to protection. But location, where are your people located, where your key people are going to be, if they're traveling in the country, out of the country, that type of thing. And in these 2 slides, I'm going to cover just this huge topic called risk, but I'll try to distill it down to some key objectives for a risk management program, and not to raise alarm bells when I say risk management program. Really going through this exercise over the next 2 slides gets you most of the way there. But why is a risk assessment really important, and do you really need to conduct one? I spoiled it by saying yes, you do, but it's really important because knowing your risks determines a number of things within your organization. And some people kind of get a feel for this. Like, I know that server is important, but you really need to quantify how important is that service or that server. So what are the assets most likely to cause financial harm to your company if one of those assets were to fail? And what's the anticipated loss? These are all very key output items from a risk assessment. And it kind of informs you how much you should spend in both time and money protecting an asset. If a file server goes down, is it critical to your business? What about your front-end load balancer? Is that critical? You might think both are critical, but one is more critical than the other. And when you're maintaining resources and budgets, knowing quantitatively which one is more important to your company is important. It helps make those decisions. We tend to think of risk assessments in terms of IT and security, but they really should incorporate the entire company. Charlie brought up a really good point with HR. Don't forget HR, don't forget finance, and don't forget marketing. Marketing is very popular in many organizations for going out and maintaining the front end image, your commercial website. So that's your presence to the world. And you may have like a systems team or an SRE team that manages the back end, the actual business logic. And you may forget or may not even know that you have this front end website that's being managed by a marketing team. And I say marketing because most of the time it's marketing, but it could be other teams. The point is, you may not really calculate the risk from that website. You may not know about it, you may not know who owns it, but if the website is breached and someone defaces it, you suffer some pretty severe reputational harm. And that is one example of why it's so important to include the entire enterprise when you are conducting a risk assessment. Everyone has their own risks, and they should be cataloged and assessed against all of the other risks, because that's what your executive team needs to make the best decision in responding to them. And those things that I mentioned, these 4 elements, you'll see where they get reused. And reuse is just a wonderful word that compliance professionals like to hear. We like to hear reuse because you do see a lot of duplication within controls, within requirements, within evidence, within policies. So wherever we can reuse things, we want to do that. I've gone over number one. Charlie, I'll pause here for just a moment before I keep going. Anything you want to add at this point?
Yeah, I think one of the other critical items for a risk assessment is the change, right? There's change landscape of IT and security. It's almost daily. The Colonial Pipeline probably did a risk assessment a couple of years ago or last year prior to getting hit with ransomware, and it might have looked a lot different than it would today. They might have been worried about physical controls and physical issues with the pipeline, and then they get hit with ransomware and they're down for a long period of time, and the supply chain is impacted. So now the risk assessment should change, and that's why it's critical to have a risk assessment done each year because of the changing landscape of security.
Yeah, great point, Charlie. Thanks for that. When we're talking about interruptions to the business, it's good to know where all of our assets sit, because remember, we've just done an inventory of our assets. We know the software we're using, the hardware, we know about people and data. But what happens if we lose a particular piece of hardware? What happens if an entire process fails? If a server fails, if your call center trunk goes down, too many people, too many employees specifically can't log in or reach the office. Knowing the effect and the extent of that impact for an interruption on your business is a really key input to a risk assessment. They can be captured in something formal like a business impact analysis, which I have on step number 2, or just simple use cases. If something doesn't happen or fails to happen and we experience a business interruption, what is the impact, both in terms of productivity, financial loss, et cetera? These are all really good inputs into our risk assessment. We're kind of doing a risk assessment right now, by the way. If you're ever wondering when does this start, we've kind of already started it with the collection of inventory. We capture all of these risk items in a risk register. Here I have a screenshot of the risk register. This is a sample one in Hyperproof, but this is where you'll be working out of for the most part as you identify your risks. It's the place to capture and basically catalog all of the risks that you have identified. And they're critical because this is the thing that will spin off other activities for prioritizing impact, severity of your risk, et cetera, et cetera. Second and last slide. I know I'm spending a lot of time here on risk, but I feel it's really an important piece to your standing up your compliance program. And now that we have all the data collected, we've cataloged it in our risk register. There are a number of things that can now happen. I don't want to get into too much in the details here because risk and risk management is in itself its own profession, it's its own discipline. There is a lot of detail we can get into here. But a key message here is that a variety of activities occur to determine the severity of the risk, the likelihood, the impact, et cetera. An application, like Hyperproof, can help with all of these activities. I'd be remiss without saying that. But the main objective here is to get enough detail on each risk so we know how to treat that risk. With everything we've done up to this point, with all the data that we collected, some key activities that we would need to follow to move forward is just to assign the likelihood and impact to a risk item. This is at its core what how you would rate or score your risk, the very two common risk measurements. So if we look below in this heat map, and you've probably seen many derivatives of a heat map, but what we're trying to do is score our risks so we know which ones to focus on. If we have 100 risks, but maybe only 4 sit in this upper right quadrant where it's very high or critical, those 4 are the ones we want to address first. It'd be nice if we could address all of the risks, but in reality, we're really concerned about those most critical ones, those high ones. And how we respond is up to us So there are 4 common ways that we can respond to risk. We can just avoid it altogether. Let's say we were using a library that's no longer being maintained in our code. Well, we can just not use that library anymore. We can find something else that maybe has that same functionality. That's called risk avoidance. We can transfer a risk. This almost always relates to insurance. Ultimately, we're responsible for our products and services, so we never really get rid of that risk. But we could buy something like cyber insurance to help transfer some of that. Can't think of the word, but some of that risk off to the insurance company. We can just straight up accept a risk where it, yeah, we acknowledge it's there, probably not big enough for us to worry about, so we'll accept it. But far and away, the most common way to treat a risk is through mitigation and the application of compensating controls. Or maybe we didn't even have a control for that risk to begin with, and so we need to implement a new control. And when we talk about risk mitigation, that, at least to me, it implies a lot more work. Sometimes it's project work. Sometimes it's just resetting your password policy, which could be done in, from the technical side, the IT side, maybe a few minutes a day of informing people, through email or however we communicate internally, that the password policy has changed. Another way, another remediation item may take quarters, months to implement a fix. And there's a lot here. I talked about a lot of stuff, but I just want to go over 2 big takeaways, and then I'm going to turn it over to Charlie. But first big takeaway is, yes, you should conduct regular risk assessments. As Charlie mentioned, at least annually. But also, if you have significant changes to your organization, whether it's your platform, let's say you move from Azure to AWS or from AWS to Google Cloud, that's a big change in your environment. And a risk assessment would probably be warranted to make sure that all of your risks that you had previously identified, either they're still there, new ones may be introduced, or maybe some have basically dropped because you're using a different platform. And I used a lot of terminology and quickly ran through risk assessment. But just remember, it's an exercise we go through to identify risks and reduce the overall risk exposure and our risk score to our organization. Okay. A lot of talking. Charlie, I'm going to hand this one over to you, if you don't mind.
All right, buddy, take a break. All right, what's typically required by all compliance frameworks? So policies we've talked about, early on, they're required literally for every single law, regulation, and standard. Risk assessments that Aaron just talked about. And then there's key control categories. So, I'm not going to read these, but said a different way, every one of them has, sort of this entity level control, this tone at the top. How does management push down, directives, to secure information? They also have change management, physical and logical security. They have computer operations, your backup, your batch processes. How do you control those things? How do you control remote access to your network? So, every law, regulation, standard is a little bit different, but there's these foundational controls that need to be in place, and these things that need to be addressed. Also, they require that evidence of control testing, whether it's internal or external. We've talked a little bit about a SOC 2, and that's a test, by a CPA firm of your control environment. Can't be done internally, but smaller organizations may do some basic control testing internally. PCI, for example, allows organizations to self-attest if they have a certain volume of credit card transactions. Generally, it's very low volumes, then they're allowed to self-attest and essentially test their own controls. So it is available, but it's in certain situations and based on the control framework that you're trying to adhere to. The next thing is company policies that you'll need to develop. So there's a lot, depending on your organization. So business continuity, BCP plan, you'll hear it called. How do you test and ensure your data can be stood back up in the event that you either lose it because of a hardware issue or a ransomware attack? Acceptable use. Do you tell organizations and the people within that company what they can and cannot do? So, could you prevent them from going out and using, personal email throughout the day? 10 years ago, we got called probably monthly from organizations that got hit with a virus because they allowed their staff to, log on and use their personal email at work. They click on a link, and the next thing you know, we're being called to try to help clean it up. And it's probably not all that different now. Now it's ransomware that's hitting places, and so acceptable use policy is pretty important. Information security policy, it sort of speaks for itself. How do you secure your network, operating system, database, and application? Access control falls into that same space. Configuration management policy, how are you rolling out devices to make sure that they're void of any known vulnerabilities that could be exploited by a hacker? Incident response and disaster recovery are essentially the same thing. How do you avoid a disaster or respond to an incident? Could be ransomware, malware, or otherwise. And there's privacy policies as well. There's a myriad of other ones, like change management is a big one. How do you ensure that changes to your environment are complete, accurate, and valid, so that they don't disrupt the day-to-day operations of your environment? So there's a myriad of them, and as we said, you can get these templates and they'll get you a portion of the way there, but they need to be heavily customized. The next slide, understanding the controls. What are controls? So we've talked a lot about this. Essentially, controls describe requirements or activities, and they describe the people, processes, and technology that are built around it to satisfy that requirement. There's an example of one on here, but there's potentially hundreds of controls based on the law, regulation, and standard that you need to adhere to. I mentioned PCI before. If you store credit card data, you're loosely defined as a merchant type D, which requires you to have in place over 250 controls. So, you don't have an opportunity to really select those controls in that scenario, but you can build, your own internal controls around those. So if they say, hey, you've got to limit, or you've got to ensure that multi-factor authentication is required for all external users, you can build that however it works for your organization. You can use different technology to achieve that. So, but you need to understand your controls. You need to understand your environment. You need to understand your risks. If you're building your controls for a certain law, regulation, or standard, you need to know what the auditor is going to ask for. So it may behoove you to engage an external auditor or someone who's gone through this process before, that understands what they're going to ask for. I mentioned earlier that I've been on both sides of the table. It was very frustrating for me when I had what I call real work to do as a system administrator, and someone would come in and say, hey, Charlie, how do you ensure the security of the information in your database? Well, that is such a wide open and open-ended question. Like, it's almost impossible to answer in under an hour. So, but knowing what they will ask for and building a control framework that addresses each of those areas. Because when you start looking at a database, how do you control? You limit power user access. You limit the ability to query the database. You limit, network, operating system, and application layer access. So, understanding what's at risk and what your auditor is going to ask, you may want to engage somebody for that. And what does it mean to monitor or manage controls on an ongoing basis? So, Aaron, you're in this space all day long. What's this mean to you, and what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I don't want to say it was a common misconception, just in general within organizations, but your compliance program isn't something you do once a year. It's something that you continually maintain. And when I look at monitor or manage controls, what that means to me is those controls describe any number of things: an activity, a process, a procedure, even a particular vulnerability scanning scheme that we use. We need to ensure that those controls at any point in time reflect what we're actually doing operationally. And so when you think about this, it's a pretty big task to manage and monitor those controls on an ongoing basis. Fortunately, some of these controls don't have a cadence where it's a continuous monitoring or a daily. It might be an annual cadence. So as long as that control has been executed sufficiently and adequately, meaning it's serving the purpose that it was written for, and the implementation aspect of it is sound, so it passes the test essentially, then that's great. For something that you do once a year, that's easy. Well, I don't want to say it's easy, but that's part of the management and monitoring aspect, is just knowing when those controls need to be reviewed.
Thanks, Aaron. Understanding the controls we talked about. There's a brief description of the control. There's multiple control functions. Detective controls. Those are ones like a log monitoring utility that'll detect, let's say, escalated privileges. So what we've seen in the PCI space over the years, that we'll see an account being escalated at an odd time of the day, and our monitoring utility will alert our folks and say, hey, this doesn't seem right, and then they're going to go out and figure out what it is and see if it's appropriate. Preventative would be exactly that, something that prevents an issue. So you might have controls at your firewall level that prevent traffic from a nation state that is notorious for hacking, like Russia or North Korea. So those preventative controls will prevent issues from impacting your environment, at least hopefully. And then corrective functions. So those controls help mitigate the risk once a control failure has been in place. We often call them mitigating controls. So, mitigating control might be reviewing all user access on an annual basis. You say, well, that sounds like a pretty good control, but it's really a corrective or potentially mitigating control for your new user setup process, right? So if you have a new user setup process that requires, network, database, application, and operating system level access, and that works 95% of the time correctly, then it shouldn't be that big of a deal to have an annual control whereby you just do a final review to ensure that that other process did actually work as expected. And then there's control types: physical, technical, and administrative. So physical is exactly that: physical controls to your hardware components, your facility, whatever that may be. Technical controls, how you permit access to your systems and your network and your databases. And administrative could be those things outside of IT that impact the control environment. Aaron, what did I miss on this? What things stick out to you as sort of the things that you think these guys should be aware of as they're standing up their plan?
No, I think you covered it well, Charlie. And we're spending so much time on controls because it's really that thing that binds all of your operations together. And so it's a way to manage your compliance efforts. If you have one program that applies to you, it doesn't seem, probably what we're talking about may seem a little bit much, but that second program that you add to your compliance program that you must, comply with, the amount of complexity that suddenly gets introduced would be surprising to you. And it's through these controls that you get kind of a simplified view of what you're doing and what you need to do to ensure you pass your audits. Awesome, Charlie. I'll go ahead and take this next one for selecting controls, because this is one of our big questions is, okay, Aaron, Charlie, you're talking a lot about controls. So how do I know what controls I need to write for my organization, or we need to, we need to follow up with? Some of that's already done through your risk assessment to mitigate risk. But, there are two real practical options that you have. You can adopt a set of default or illustrative controls. If you know that you're going to have a SOC 2, there are sample controls out there. And one of them, actually, it's our third bullet point. Organization, they've done a great job with the secure controls framework, where they have general controls for many different categories across many different programs. If you've never looked at this, when you first look at it, it's a bit mind-blowing because it's an enormous spreadsheet. And I mean enormous spreadsheet. But it has a lot of these controls that you can adopt. with the caveat that whatever you do adopt, you need to make sure it does reflect how your organization operates. So we keep saying that over and over again, but we don't want you to leave the webinar thinking, oh, they said I could go take these controls and assert that that's what we do, and then we fail an audit. You really do need to look at those controls. They're a good jumping off point, saying this is where I'm starting. Now I'm going to tailor them to my organization. ISO, another one here, ISO 27001, the Annex A. It's the second part, really, of 27001 that has the control requirements. And I think, Charlie, do you run into this issue where controls and requirements get confused a lot?
Yeah, definitely year one, right? So people are just sort of drinking out of a fire hose. So there's a lot to take in, and they're trying to stand things up, and they're writing policies, and they're purchasing potential software solutions. So we do see it quite a bit in year one, but it irons out after that. And that's, sort of gets to our point from earlier of, you may want to look into having an external auditor or consultant come in to just work through that with, the organization. I keep saying it because I've been, a system administrator and a programmer. I had real work to do in deciphering what an auditor or what a compliance person or security person is asking for. Is time consuming and frustrating. So, but you learn from year one experiences, and generally year two, it's a much smoother sail.
I'm glad you brought that up, Charlie, because I've been on both sides where we've hired someone to write controls and have tried to write them myself. And this is where an external resource can really help you out. It is an enormous effort to write your controls. If you do it on your own, I think that's a great suggestion to have someone else come help you do that. If you adopt a control framework, or you just kind of tailor according to the requirements, like in a SOC 2 or 27001, you're still doing a lot of work because you do have to go review all those controls and tailor them to your organization. Wrapping this up on controls, once you've identified controls and how they apply to your org, how they satisfy requirements, this is a step that will save you a lot of grief, is assign ownership to those controls. It's not the compliance team. Compliance team does have some controls that do apply to them for sure, but ensuring that you're, you have proper network segmentation, because let's say you're operating in a multi-tenant environment, you have to demonstrate logical separation of customer instances in that multi-tenant environment. Who owns that? Is it your application team? Is it your networking team? Is it your infrastructure team? This is something you need to identify so they understand what the expectations are. This is huge. You don't want to get into an audit where you have to demonstrate that, in this case, logical separation, and then everyone's shrugging their shoulders because I thought they were doing it. Make sure that you have control ownership assigned. And kind of part of that is, who gathers evidence as part of the audit, who remedies the gaps from testing. These are all, they're all very important, but ultimately have those controls assigned to someone that can speak to them, that will take ownership, and ensure that evidence does get collected based on that control, and gaps will get fixed once they're reported to that owner. We kind of talked about the step 3 is frequency of control operation and testing. And this is a great question that you brought up, Charlie. What does it mean to manage and maintain? Well, some controls, based on the requirements they're written against, need to be tested, maybe just annually. Some will be quarterly, monthly, weekly, continuous. And here's some examples. These are just some I just grabbed out of the air. But ensuring that you meet those cadences is extremely important. You miss a month on a control that's supposed to be tested monthly, you will get dinged on that in an audit.
All right, the next slide is preparing for an audit. The best way to prepare is to have a gap assessment. Either do it internally with your compliance folks, or have somebody come in, from the outside who has a specialty in the area or the control framework that you're trying to adhere to. So essentially, it's exactly that. you go through the controls with the person or your internal folks. You'll identify where there's gaps. You'll figure out a way to remediate them, and hopefully get everything remediated prior to your external audit. The last thing you want is, strikes against you when the external auditor comes in. Things you should expect from an external audit: if you're in the SOC space, SOC 2 or SOC 1, you're looking at major or minor issues, a qualified opinion or unqualified. What that really means is if you've aggregated a large number of control failures, the auditing firm may have to change their opinion and say, controls don't appear to operate effectively, right? And so, those are based on exceptions, whether they're critical or high risk exceptions, obviously impact what the findings are and what the auditor's opinion is. At the end of those, you should always ask for, anything like opportunities for improvement wise or lessons learned. You should do, the opportunities for improvement should be provided by your external auditor. The lessons learned, you should be done internally with your folks to, figure out why you failed or why you had issues or what went well and what could get, could go even better. But the one thing to note here, once the audit period ends, you're probably already into the next audit period. So it's just another note here to drive home that compliance and adhering to your audit needs, it doesn't end when the auditor leaves.
Yep. Thanks, Trey. Such a great point. Pat yourself on the back because it's a milestone. You can celebrate, but just know that your next audit just started, essentially. And part of maintaining your compliance program to prepare for the next audit, a couple of ideas here. One is just to perform a regular control self-assessment. CSAs, I think that's a pretty common term. Choose controls, and this is kind of up to you. This is an internal activity and effort on your part. Choose controls that you want to test to make sure that they are still written to meet the requirements and they're still being implemented as described in the control. And as a result of that, add, modify, remove controls as needed. Again, as your environment changes, that needs to be reflected within your controls, because when you get to that audit, the auditor is going to be looking at those controls, and that's what you're getting tested against. If you can collect evidence on an ongoing basis, and this should be every one of us, do that. Whether it's manual, that's a bit laborious, understand, but this is where automation and software tools can really help you out. If you can automate policy update collection, that's great. Vulnerability scans, maybe save it to a particular drive, or if you have a tool that syncs into a service, it'll pull that automatically. Leverage automation as much as you can, and then just stay on top of risks. We've mentioned this quite a bit, but make sure that your tech stack is still something that it's what you expect it to be, and your Red Hat servers, for example, didn't suddenly become CentOS servers. That I've seen that happen before. You need to understand and stay on top of the configuration changes, so any change to your risk profile is captured. And sure,
I'll take this one. So we talked about the gap assessment. How can consultants help support your journey? A gap assessment. Hire an expert to come in, figure out where your control gaps are, and suggest ways to remediate them. Policy development and assistance. There's so many policies that you may need to have that, it could become time consuming to write on your own. The only thing worse than reading hundreds of pages of policies is actually writing them. So it might be behoove you guys to hire somebody to come in and do that for you. And then a readiness assessment, an independent review of the environment, to ensure that you're ready and able to pass an audit.
Awesome. I won't go over this last slide since we were running out of time, but Taryn, maybe we can bring you back in. And sorry for the rush there at the end, everyone.
Thanks, Aaron. So we have time for just, I think, 2 questions. So the first one is, in your experience, what is the most common mistake people make building or maintaining their compliance programs?
I'll go quick. Yeah,
Okay.
I'll go quick from my side because we're consultants trying to help stand these up. The biggest issue that I see on a regular basis is that people underestimate the level of effort to put the controls in place, and that was sort of the beginning of this slide in this presentation was, I can do this in 2 weeks. You can't. And the other thing that is always difficult, this is an ongoing process. We said it on an earlier slide. When we leave, that doesn't mean your controls can't operate effectively. Somebody's coming back to ensure that those are operating effectively later on. So it's standing these up with the right amount of time, effort, as well as ensuring that they maintain their operational effectiveness over time.
Yep. Well put, Charlie.
And then we have one last question. If I'm considering using a software like Hyperproof or another vendor, what are some critical things I need it to do in order to accomplish what I'm trying to do with compliance?
Yep, this one's probably for me. Probably one of the most key components, at least that I would say, coming from the oddity side of things, is gone are the days where you have one program that you need to maintain. It's going to be several, and there'll be regulatory, there'll be privacy, there'll be security control frameworks. Find a tool, whether it's Hyperproof or another tool, that allows you to map common requirements across those programs, and by extension, your controls, because you don't want to write a control for every requirement for every program. You want to write a control once, ideally, that maps across various programs that have similar requirements. So almost every program, for example, will have a password policy requirement. You don't need to write a separate control for each of those programs. You write one, make sure it is written to satisfy the requirement of those three, and then let the tool do the mapping for you. So there's only one control for you to test to satisfy a variety of requirements. That's probably one of the biggest ones, I would say.
Perfect. All right, thank you, everyone. I think that's all the time that we have for questions today. I hope you enjoyed this webinar. As I mentioned, the recording will be available on demand with this link shortly after the webinar has concluded. And please look out for more webinars to come on Hyperproof's Bright Talk channel and also in your email. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Taryn, and thanks, Charlie. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you both.